Welcome everyone to our first Lunch and Learn on the HUD Grant Fundamentals. Today we're going to be talking about the Home Investment Partnership Program. We expect this presentation to take around 30 to 40 minutes. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll be providing you with an email address. So if you have any questions, you can send them our way and we can be sure to answer any questions that you might have. My name is Julie Johnston. I am a compliance specialist with the city and am responsible with other staff for managing our federal grants, particularly the home and our CDBG grants. So let's just get right into the Home Investment Partnership Program. And I would like to state too that this is just an overview of the federal requirements. This presentation is not intended to provide you with all of the regulations related to the home program. We certainly will work with you if you become a recipient of a home funding, but we wanted to provide this presentation to give you an understanding of what the home program is and what you'll be responsible for if you receive home funding through the city. So our agenda today, we're going to talk about what is home. We're going to talk about home and how it relates to the city of Kalamazoo specifically. Eligibility to receive home funding. Some of the requirements that you'll have to meet through matching funds and other federal requirements outside of the home program. And then I'll just spend a quick minute talking about community housing development organizations. So we are going to be doing 7 total training modules. This is the timeline for the live training modules that we will be doing. But all of these will also be placed on the city's website if you cannot attend any of the live events. So the trainings we're expecting to do is home, and then an overview of the CDBG program. We're going to do some financial management, reporting and record keeping, what type of procurement is allowed through the federal programs, environmental review responsibilities, and then finally, our application process for submitting an application for federal funding. So what is the home program? Home is all about housing. It is a HUD, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development formula grant, which means that the city does not have to compete for these funds. They are provided to us annually, and then we utilize those funds both internally for housing projects and then also grant out some funds for housing projects. So they provide a certain amount to us annually based on a formula that HUD has created. And that formula includes things like, do we have an adequate supply of housing? Is any of our housing substandard? How many low-income families live in the city? What is the cost for producing new housing in the city? And there's multiple other things that go into this formula, and that determines how much money we get on an annual basis. One of the great things about the home program is that we are not limited to just supplying funding to nonprofits. We can also work with for-profit affordable housing developers. And you'll understand why that is as we get farther into the presentation, because it's related to affordability periods. So whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit developer, you have the same requirements for supporting low-income families. Okay, so how does home relate to the city and what type of specific requirements do we have? Home was established in 1990, and the city has received funding since 1992. Prior to the home program, most of the city's housing activities were funded through Community Development Block Grant through that program. But now almost all of our rehabilitation or new construction of single or rental development is funded through the home program. So this is the funding trend for both CDBG and home over the last, I believe this is 20 years. Yep, 20 years. You can see that CDBG, which is the blue graph, we do receive a lot more funding in CDBG than home. But over the last 6 years, it's been pretty consistent that we get about $550,000 in home funding annually. And CDBG has remained pretty steady at about $1.6 million annually. Okay, so here's where we get to the nitty-gritty of whether your project would be eligible for home dollars. So we're going to get into the eligibility criteria, both HUD's criteria and some city criteria. Okay, so for eligibility for your project, it must be located in the city of Kalamazoo, which seems pretty self-explanatory. But we focus our projects within a strategic area, which is the neighborhoods that surround our downtown. So these neighborhoods include East Side, Edison, Fairmont, North Side, Stewart, and Vine. And we've been focusing our funding, both CDBG and home, in these areas for a number of years and expect to do that in the future as well. And of course, your project must be eligible under the HUD home program. Okay, so we're going to talk about what some of these eligible projects are. Really, almost any type of affordable housing can be developed using home funding. All the activities shown on this slide can be funded for both single family and multifamily housing. The last bullet there, tenant-based rental assistance, is essentially direct assistance through providing monthly rent to low-income families. So we have some nonprofit organizations that support low-income families by helping them with their monthly rent. One activity that the city does not fund with home dollars, and this is very important, is owner-occupied rehabilitation. So if you're considering an owner-occupied project, then you need to look to the CDBG program, not the home program. The main reason for this is that the home program requires the entire house to meet a set of specific standards, a set of specific property standards. So if, let's say you wanted to do an activity where you were going to replace windows in some of our older homes, you would have to go into the home and do an assessment to determine what other improvements need to be made. And then you would have to bring the whole property up to HUD standards. So that might mean one property could utilize your entire funding that you receive from the city. So we focus owner-occupied rehabilitation with CDBG dollars. Home can cover almost anything in developing affordable housing, from site improvements, the demolition, to the construction of new housing. So if you needed assistance demolishing an existing property so you could build new, home could work for you. If you need to bring in new sanitary sewer and water, home can cover those costs. So it's almost anything related to the construction of a project. Home will also cover many of the soft costs related to development of new housing, including interior improvements. So if you are finding that you need some assistance with the interior improvements of a building or paying for your engineering fees, home can cover that as well. Some of the soft costs, though, that home will not cover are any project or operating reserves, rental assistance to any existing Section 8 housing, funds for projects that were already assisted with home. So if we've provided you home funding and you find you have a gap, we cannot provide you any additional home funding. Acquisition of property that's owned by the city, or the rehabilitation of any commercial spaces, rehab or construction of any commercial spaces in a mixed-use development. When you think about home, just think about housing. Okay, next we're going to talk about the affordability period. And again, this is both for nonprofits doing affordable housing development and for-profit developers. We're going to go over what affordability means to HUD and what we have to comply with. So the first is ensuring that we are supporting low-income families. The income limits shown on the screen were established in 2023, and it's very likely that we'll be receiving new income limits from HUD in the spring of 2024. Income limits typically come out in the spring of every year. But for now, a household of 4 persons cannot make more than $73,300 to be considered eligible for a HUD program. And essentially what that is 80% or less of the area median income for the Kalamazoo Portage metropolitan area. HUD includes Portage in our income calculations, and because of that, these incomes may seem slightly higher than what we would expect for families in Kalamazoo. But what that essentially means is that then more of our families are likely eligible for HUD programs. With that said, though, under the home program, a certain percentage of the households being assisted must meet the 60% or less of the area median income. So if you're doing a rental or a new owner-occupied project, the city has to ensure that a certain percentage of those households are making 60% or less. So if you were thinking that you could do a rental program and rent to all 80% or less area median income, we would have to adjust that so that some of the households are 60% or less. The next part of the affordability period is fair market rents. HUD establishes these annually as well. Typically, they come out in the fall to winter of each year. For home, rents are the lesser of either these fair market rents shown on the slide or a rent that does not exceed 30% of the adjusted income of a family making 65% of the area median income. So that's saying a lot right there, but essentially what we're trying to do is to make sure that a family is not overburdened by their rental costs. So we would be looking at what does the family make, what is the fair market rent, and what is a reasonable rent for that family to pay. Okay, so affordability period. The main things that we're looking at is housing where an occupant pays no more than 30% of their gross income for housing costs. This includes utilities. So if you require your household to pay utilities separate, we have to figure that into their rent, which would reduce the amount of rent that you would collect monthly. Once a project is completed, the city will record an affordability deed restriction on the property, and that's when the affordability period begins. These deed restrictions are required by HUD, and it's to ensure that the affordability period will last for the full amount that is required. So if you sell the property, say you have a 15-year affordability period and you sell the property 5 years in, that deed restriction ensures that the next property owner understands that they also have to meet the affordability period for the remainder of the 10 years. Once the affordability period is over, the deed restriction is lifted and there are no further requirements under the home program. So this applies to all home assisted units, whether it's rental or owner occupied. And again, that affordability period starts when the deed restriction is recorded by the city. So the affordability period is based on the amount of funding that we invest in an individual unit. So if we invest $10,000 into a rental unit, then that's 5 years of affordability. For any new construction of rental projects, it is always 20 years of affordability period. Rehab is between that under 15 to 40,000, but new construction is always 20 years. And then we monitor during that affordability period. There's reporting that you have to do annually as if you have a rental project. We monitor on site to make sure that records are being maintained, that the families living in the units are low income, that you are charging them the correct rent. We also do affordability periods and record deed restrictions on owner-occupied housing, so we would be monitoring those as well. And finally, it's a way for us to evaluate whether the project is going to be able to perform through the entirety of the affordability period. So monitoring and your requirements to do reporting and the accountability to the city and to the federal government is an important component of the home program. Okay, then as an awardee of home funding, there is a requirement that you also provide some match. You have to contribute to the project as well. It is not just home dollars into the project. So you must provide a 25% match with non-federal funds. So some other source of funding, and we're going to go over what those potential match contributions could be. So first, like I said, it could be a cash contribution from a non-federal source. It could be value of taxes that you've paid or deferred taxes. It can be the cost of infrastructure improvements that you've made to the site. It can be proceeds from a bond issue that you might have made to develop the affordable housing. It can be the value of preparing the site. It can be the value of the land, whether it's donated or other real property that you've paid for without using federal funds. It can be supportive services that you plan to provide to the families. So there are a lot of ways that you can meet your match requirement, and the city will work with you prior to signing any agreement for home funds to determine what your match requirement is going to be. 25% is the minimum requirement, but certainly in most affordable housing projects, you're going to exceed that. Okay, we've talked about home requirements. Now we're going to talk about some of the other federal requirements that you have to meet when using any federal funding. So the first is primarily religious organizations. If you are a religious organization and you're interested in developing affordable housing, you have to sign a certificate saying that you will not require the people who are going to be either renting or purchasing the units that you build, that they have to be a member of your, that there's no membership criteria for your religious organization, that they don't have to attend any religious activities. It's home funds may not be provided to primarily religious organizations for anything related to the religious activity. And then for equal opportunity and fair housing, we will expect you to have policies and procedures in place around these two requirements. We will review those before the project begins. We'll also review other policies that you may have, like if you're doing a rental project, like tenant selection policies, to ensure that they prohibit discrimination. An important component of these laws to remember is that you are taking reasonable steps to ensure that everyone has meaningful access to your project, that you are not targeting, and then you are making your ownership or rental projects open to anyone who's interested in either purchasing or living in the units. Displacement and relocation. So The city will not fund any project that is going to displace or require relocation of people living in the unit. So if you are thinking of using home funds to do a rental rehab where the building is occupied, then you need to think about other types of federal funding or other types of non-federal funding for that project. The city will not displace residents. Think about rehab of only vacant projects or constructing new. And again, for the home program, we do not provide funding for owner-occupied rehabilitation. Okay, property management standards. HUD has requirements that property must meet a certain standard for the people who are living in it. There is a new standard that has just come into place. It's called the National Standards for the Physical Inspection of Real Estate. And basically what HUD wants to know is that the funds that they have invested are ensuring that the property that people are living in is safe and viable for them, for their housing. This national standard for the physical inspection of real estate also includes things like ensuring basic property management and that your staff understands what that means, that you provide fair housing training, that you are encouraging professional education of your staff, those types of things, so that as your specifically rental projects move forward, you have staff that understand what those standards are and that they must be met. There are also specific requirements for your rental leases. The screen provides you with the language that is not allowed to be in your leases. And the city will review any rental leases prior to occupancy to ensure that this prohibitive language is not included. The intent here is to protect the rights of the tenant, to make sure that we are not burdening them with a specific type of lease regulation that limits their ability to utilize the unit. And then the Violence Against Women Act. This was established to protect survivors of domestic violence. For home assisted rental projects, you are required to have a Violence Against Women Act addendum in your lease. You must notify the occupants that they have the right within your rental agreements to allow things like an emergency transfer. If they need a confidentiality of survivor rights. If there needs to be a document of a violent act, that all of these things are spelled out in the agreement and that a person moving in understands what their rights are under this act. So next is Section 3, and Section 3 is essentially an economic opportunity for people living in the neighborhood where your project is being developed. HUD put this into place to try and expand their I'm sorry. I'm going to cut right here. Take pause for a moment. So the next rule that we need to understand is Section 3, and HUD encourages projects to employ low and very low income persons from the surrounding neighborhood where a project is located. The intent of this is to not only support new housing in a neighborhood, but also to provide some economic opportunities for those living in the neighborhood. So if your project receives more than $200,000 in home funding, we will also be talking to you about Section 3 and having you reporting on if you are employing any residents that meet the Section 3 criteria. The next is persons with disabilities. Equal opportunity to home activities also includes persons with disabilities. This is particularly true for our rental projects that are receiving federal funds. If you have an accessible unit within your rental project, you have to offer this unit first to persons with disabilities. And it must first be to persons with disabilities that are already living within your rental project. If you have no one that needs the unit, then you have to market that unit to persons with disabilities before you lease it out. So you will have to have policies and procedures in place for this. And this kind of goes hand in hand with affirmative marketing. Again, you'll have to have policies and procedures in place for this. You'll have to create an affirmative marketing plan, which we will review prior to occupancy of the home assisted units. And it has to include activities like advertising, community outreach, how you're going to keep your records about your affirmative marketing. We'll look at your tenant selection policies. And again, it's about reaching people so there's equal opportunity for your project and your activity. Prevailing wage. If we are assisting more than 12 units within your project, and this could be 12 renter or owner occupied units, then prevailing wage requirements come into play. And we will certainly work with you to ensure you understand what those prevailing wage requirements are throughout the construction of your project. Environmental review and compliance. This is required before $1 of HUD funding can be spent. So if you are in the middle of developing a new project, we cannot come in and help you. We have to help you at the very beginning of the project with any funding. So please remember, this is so important. Not $1 of construction can happen before the home funding is provided to your activity and we have an agreement signed with the city. Typically, this is a two-phase process. The first phase is done during the action plan development, which is handled by the city. And then there's typically a second phase, which is a site-specific environmental review for your project. We are going to have a training on environmental review. It's part of our training module. So if you are interested in learning more about the environmental review process, then access that training module once it's up on the city's website. And then conflict of interest. As a recipient of HUD funding, you have to have written policies and procedures around conflict of interest. You have to be sure that any real or perceived financial or contractual conflict of interest is being managed. And again, we will be reviewing these policies prior to occupancy or use of home funding. The next is lead-based paint. Any project, any rehabilitation project on a unit that is older than 1978 or 1978 and older has to follow the lead-based paint rules. There are a lot of rules around lead-based paint remediation. If your project involves lead-based paint, then we will work with you to ensure that oversight is done correctly, that remediation is done correctly. There are specific contractors that are trained in lead-based paint remediation that you'll have to use. So we'll certainly work with you on that. And this is both, again, for owner and renter occupied. It doesn't matter. If the property is 1978 or older, then we have to consider lead-based paint removal. Okay, so that was all of the other federal requirements that you need to be aware of. And now I'm just going to spend a couple minutes talking about community housing development organizations. These organizations are specific to the home program, so they are not with other federal dollars like CDBG. This is specific to home funding. Okay, CHDO, which is the acronym that we use for community housing development organizations, is a 501c3 nonprofit that has to have affordable housing as its mission. It has to show that it has a demonstrated capacity for building affordable housing, for utilizing home funding, and that it has historically served our low-income households in the city. CHDO can use home dollars to develop affordable housing. And to be able to do this, they have to show, again, that commitment to affordable housing. And part of that is by having a certain percentage of their membership as low-income residents, and that they have to provide a formal process for low-income beneficiaries to weigh in on their activities. HUD requires that 15% of our home funding goes to a CHDO annually. So if you become a CHDO, then you have a higher percentage chance of receiving home funding on an annual basis. Okay, so we're just going to recap the presentation, and does this funding fit my project? So after hearing many of the rules related to home and many of the other cross-cutting federal requirements that must be met, you'll need to think about, is your organization ready for federal funding? So do you have the capacity to manage all the reporting requirements and all the development of policies and procedures and things that need to be managed with home funding? Is my project an affordable housing project? So do I want to manage the long-term affordability that is required utilizing home funds? Am I willing and am I able to handle all those federal requirements for multiple years, like making sure you're maintaining your records, that the city is going to be coming out and doing monitoring of all your records, both your program records and your tenant records? You know, can you manage compliance for the affordability period? And if you feel like you are ready for that, then I would absolutely recommend that you attend the training module on submitting an application to the city. In fact, I would recommend you attend all the training modules so you can learn more about these federal requirements. So if you have any questions about what you've heard today, please feel free to send an email to cpedcompliance@kalamazooCity.org, and one of the compliance staff members here at the city will answer your question. I hope this training has been informative, and I hope you'll attend some of our other modules to learn more about federal funding. Thank you.